Hi, my name is Becca. I'm a tour guide here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Free Tours by Foot DC's virtual Cherry Blossom Tour. The cherry blossom season is one of the best times to be in Washington, D.C., and we wanted to share it with you virtually. This year's cherry blossom bloom is going to be a little bit different, so we're trying to make sure that you guys can see these trees up close and in person through your screen. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we're actually filming this virtual tour in different stages of the cherry blossom bloom, so you might see some variations in how the trees look. If you have any questions while you're watching this tour, be sure to leave a comment below, and we'll answer your questions as soon as we see them. You guys ready to check it out? Let's go. As you're making your way around the Tidal Basin and you're in the grove of cherry trees sort of south of Independence Avenue, this is where some of the original trees were planted. You'll see a plaque actually denoting the spot of the first tree, which is no longer standing, but you can see where that tree was planted. You're also going to notice a Japanese stone lantern. This lantern was going to be gifted to us in 1921, but there were a bunch of disagreements about the size and location of the lantern, and then World War II happened, which sort of strained our relationship with Japan. So this lantern wasn't actually brought here until 1954. That year actually marked the centennial of Admiral Matthew Berry sort of going to Japan and acquiring a trade agreement with the United States. The granite lantern stands 8.5 feet tall and weighs 2 tons. Today it represents the enduring cultural partnership between our two nations. The lantern was carved in 1651 and used to stand outside a temple in the ancient city of Edo, known today as Tokyo. Its partner lantern is still there in a park famous for its cherry blossom trees. So when you come to Washington, D.C. and you come to see the beautiful Japanese cherry blossom trees, usually the first question is why? Why are there so many trees here? You can tell from the name, they're not native to Washington, D.C. We have one woman in particular to really thank for our beautiful Japanese cherry blossom trees, and that's a woman named Eliza Skidmore. Eliza Skidmore was a woman ahead of her time. She was a world traveler, a geographer, a writer, a researcher. She was one of the first female members of the National Geographic Society. She never marries, but her brother is a diplomat, and so because of his travels, she's able to go all around the world. And in the 1880s, she visits Japan for the first time, and she's just blown away by these beautiful Japanese cherry blossom trees. And when she comes back to Washington, D.C., she thinks our nation's capital should have these beautiful trees. So she starts writing letters to the Interior Department. She starts writing letters to important researchers and scientists, and she just gets told no over and over and over. And so for the next 25 years, this is what she's going to work on. She's going to just write letter after letter after letter advocating for Japanese cherry blossom trees here. And all of her pleas sort of fall on deaf ears until we have a new First Lady in the White House, a woman by the name of Helen Nellie Taft. Helen Taft, when her husband, William Howard Taft, had served as governor of the Philippines, had traveled to Japan as well. So when she hears about Eliza Skidmore's plan to acquire Japanese cherry blossom trees, First Lady Taft is on board, and she wholeheartedly supports this project. This is all going to come together at the same time that a man named Dr. David Fairchild is also advocating for the planting of cherry blossom trees in Washington, D.C. In fact, Dr. Fairchild buys trees from Pennsylvania and gives them out to D.C. school children to plant throughout the city. So remember, not all of our Japanese cherry blossom trees are around the Tidal Basin. You're going to see them all through neighborhoods, and many of those started with Fairchild's outreach to school children. Helen Nellie Taft, though, is going to be key in getting the Japanese delegation to gift us these trees. Now, our first gift of trees arrives in 1910. There are 2,000 of them. They come by boat across the Pacific Ocean. They land in Seattle. They come across the United States. And when they get here and we open up the boxes, there's a problem. There's rot and bugs, and the trees are in very bad shape, and we have to burn them. And you can imagine giving a gift to somebody and they burn the gift. Not ideal. Luckily, diplomatic heads will prevail, and we are able to get a second gift. And it's the second gift that graces our national, It's the second gift of cherry blossom trees that graces our beautiful tidal basin today. Helen Nellie Taft is going to have a majority of the second gift of trees, 3,080 trees that arrive in 1912, placed here along the tidal basin. At the time, the tidal basin was fairly newly built and there was just a motorway around, so there were no memorials, nothing here. She wanted to turn this into a beautiful public park. This was the first public beautification program undertaken by a First Lady in Washington, D.C. She said it would turn this area into a beautiful sea of cherry. So the very first tree was planted by the First Lady, Helen Nellie Taft, along with the Japanese ambassador's wife. So this is why so many of our beautiful trees are down here along the tidal basin. So today, as you walk around the tidal basin, there's only about 100 of the original trees left. We do have about 2,500 or so trees around the tidal basin, about 6,000 Japanese cherry blossom trees throughout the DC area, but only about 100 of the original trees still standing. The most important thing, I think, or the thing that people are most curious about is, when is cherry blossom season? When is peak bloom? And here's the thing. It's nature, guys. It's really hard to pinpoint an exact day for peak bloom. What you have to understand are the 5 stages of a bloom, of a blossoming. So a Japanese cherry blossom tree, as it comes out of winter, is going to have to go through 5 stages. Stage 1 is green bud. Pretty much what it sounds like. You're going to see green buds appearing on the tree. It can be in green bud stage for quite a long time. A lot of that's going to depend on how cold or how warm it is. Second stage is floret visible. This means you're going to start to see the flowers kind of emerging. The next is floret extension. Those flowers are going to be emerging out of the bud, getting longer. It's going to start to really look like there's a flower there. The next one, our favorite, always makes us giggle, Penduncle Elongation. This is where it starts to separate. You're going to actually see the individual blossoms. So one bud is going to have multiple little cherry blossoms in it. And then the 5th and final stage is puffy white. This is when those blossoms open. A lot of our cherry blossom promotion is pink, but the Yoshinos, the most abundant tree around the tidal basin, actually have white blossoms with just a little tiny bit of pink. So we call it puffy white. And we define peak bloom as when 70% of the Yoshino trees around the tidal basin have reached that 5th stage. So the truth is, you might see cherry blossom trees blooming before peak bloom, depending on where they're located in the city and depending on the weather, and you're going to see blossoms blooming after that. But when we get to that 70% number, that's peak bloom. Depending on the weather conditions, peak bloom can last anywhere from about 7 to 10 days, sometimes even less, sometimes a little bit more. So it is a very sort of short, brief period, but that's what makes it so beautiful. This is a period known as Sakura, which is when you go to watch the cherry blossoms, you literally go to see the blossoms in person. The idea is to sit, enjoy, reflect, to gather with friends, enjoy spring, participate in things like painting, photography, and just sort of commune with the trees. So if you're visiting the tidal basin and you come down here, one of the memorials you'll see is the memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. If you watch our tidal basin video, we go more in depth about the memorial and its symbolism. But one really beautiful element of putting the memorial here among all these beautiful Japanese cherry blossom trees is that our cherry blossom bloom typically happens late March, early April, depending on the weather, which coincides really beautifully with the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. He's assassinated on April 4th, 1968. So very often as we're coming around to that anniversary, you have the beautiful bloom season around it. This is really meaningful. The cherry blossom trees, because they're so ephemeral, because the bloom season is so short, it's often a time to reflect on the fleeting nature of life, on the cycle of life, that sort of death of winter and rebirth of spring. And so you have some really beautiful sort of moments of reflection here outside of the MLK Memorial. outside of the memorial to Franklin Delano Roosevelt is probably the best time to share with you what happens to these Japanese cherry blossom trees when relationships with the United States and Japan go south during World War II. So the United States initially sort of isolationist, staying out of the war, but all of that is going to change after December 7th, 1941, what Roosevelt would call a date that will live in infamy. When Pearl Harbor is attacked, American soil attacked by the Japanese, we're going to immediately enter into the Second World War. And as you can imagine, emotions are very high in the United States following the attack on Pearl Harbor. And just 3 nights later, on the night of December 10th, after midnight, when all the lights around the tidal basin had been turned off, several individuals came down and they chopped down 4 Japanese cherry blossom trees as an act of retaliation. Now you can imagine a lot of Washington residents were very upset about this. These trees were beloved. The National Park Service was very concerned, and there was a fear that throughout the rest of the war, people would come and continue to attack these trees. So the National Park Service and the Park Police would call upon volunteers and individuals to come down and help protect the trees, and the Park Police themselves would spend time down here protecting the trees. In order to sort of minimize some of that anger, the term for the trees was changed during World War II. They were commonly referred to during the war years as the Oriental flowering trees as opposed to Japanese cherry blossom trees. So if you take a look behind me, what you're seeing here is a Japanese pagoda. This was a gift from the mayor of Yokohama, Japan, and it was gifted to us in 1957, but it didn't arrive and become installed until 1958. This is a Japanese pagoda. It's made out of granite. It's 3,800 pounds, and we had a little bit of a problem when it arrived. It arrived in 5 pieces in big shipping crates, and when it got here, there were no instructions. Imagine sort of IKEA, but like just the Allen wrench. And so the National Park Service wasn't quite sure what to do. They weren't sure how to put it together, so they had to consult with the Library of Congress, bring in some experts on Japanese symbolism and imagery, and luckily they eventually got it put together here for its dedication. This is a reminder of the peaceful relations between the United States and Japan, acknowledging a treaty that was signed in 1854, and this was particularly meaningful in the decade after the Second World War, sort of reaffirming our friendship. If you take a look, it's really hard to see, but you might notice that there's sort of an engraving towards the bottom. This is a representation of the Buddha on a lotus flower. And then the pagoda itself actually represents 5 elements: sky, wind, water, fire, and earth. So when you're walking along the tidal basin enjoying the cherry blossoms, it is also a beautiful natural space. You're going to see fish in the basin. You might see people actually out here fishing. If you look closely, sometimes you'll find turtles, and every now and then you might see a beaver. We have had beavers nest down here along the tidal basin, and that actually caused a bit of a problem in the 1990s because beavers love wood, and that's what these Japanese cherry blossom trees are made out of. And so we started having a little problem with beavers attacking the trees, and in fact they were able to attack some of the smaller, younger trees to a point that it actually was damaging. So you might notice occasionally that we do have kind of netting and fencing around some of these trees to protect them against beavers, but we got very creative in 2005. In 2005 we decided to create Paddles the beaver. He's the mascot of the National Cherry Blossom Festival, and he is a reminder to people to treat these trees gently, not to touch them, climb in them, or interact with them. One of the most important things for these trees' health is to enjoy them with your eyes and from a distance and not to actually interact with them in a physical way. So one benefit of this virtual tour is you get to enjoy these trees and not cause any sort of damage to them that might hurt them in the future. This is a personal tour guide favorite, this little cherry blossom tree that could. If you notice, there aren't many other trees surrounding it. There's a lot of flooding on this side of the Tidal Basin. The Tidal Basin's over 100 years old, and like a lot of our infrastructure, could use some improvement, and so they've had to relocate a number of the trees here along the basin. So you sort of have this solitary tree standing here. It's just a sign of resilience. I love this tree, and I love that it still blooms every spring. So one important thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about Japanese cherry blossom trees, there isn't just one kind of tree. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of varieties of Japanese cherry blossom trees. Here in Washington, D.C., around the Tidal Basin and National Park area, we have 12 different varieties. The most ubiquitous, abundant are the Yoshinos. When we usually talk about peak bloom, we're talking about when 70% of those Yoshino trees reach the 5th stage. And those are the trees you're most likely going to see with the white blossoms with a little touch of pink. Lots of other trees though, 11 other kinds around this area. Next up are the Kwanzans, which are located primarily here around the Jefferson Memorial. The Kwanzans tend to bloom a little bit later, and they're really, really bright pink and puffy. So they look like cotton candy, which I think they're really beautiful. They also tend to grow taller and bigger, so they give you some variety. There's not just one kind of Japanese cherry blossom tree here along the national park area. So these trees are looking a little peduncle-y. As tour guides, our favorite stage is stage 4, Penduncle Elongation, just because it's silly to say and it makes us laugh. But for a long time, I wasn't 100% sure what the penduncle was. But if you take a look at the tree, you've got the green bud, but then the bud actually opens up into these little peduncles that are starting to stick out, and then they're going to open up into blossom. So when we talk about the penduncle elongation, it's these little pieces coming out that will then open up into the blossom. So it might be hard to imagine, but there is actually quite a bit of controversy when it comes to these beautiful cherry blossom trees. I want to tell you about the Cherry Blossom Rebellion. So we're at the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, dedicated in 1943, and today it's a beautiful memorial. It's surrounded by Kwanzan, Japanese cherry blossom trees, so it's covered with these like beautiful pink blossoms when the bloom happens. But at the time that the Jefferson was being constructed, there was actually quite a bit of controversy. There were people upset about it because to build this big memorial, they were going to have to chop down trees, like hundreds of cherry blossom trees. And at this point, 1938, when the plans are put in place, these trees had been here for 30 or 20 years. People were really, really excited about these trees. DC residents had grown to love them. So there was a very influential woman, a socialite. I like to think of her and her friends as like the first real housewives of Washington, D.C., named Sissy Patterson. If you take our DuPont Circle tour, you will definitely hear about Sissy Patterson. Sissy Patterson decides to lead a group of women to kind of protest the building of the Jefferson Memorial, and the cutting down of the cherry blossom trees. She's already been pretty critical of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in her newspapers, and she starts writing even more op-eds opposing the construction of this memorial. And then in November 1938, she gathers 80 women at her DuPont Circle mansion. They sort of get riled up at the mansion, and then they march down here to the cherry blossoms in their Sunday best, dressed with reporters watching, and they chain themselves to the trees. Not only do they chain themselves to the trees, they start chanting poems about the trees to sort of protest this movement. Now, they're hoping FDR himself will come down. He doesn't, but he's going to send a presidential secretary to accept their petition. That's not good enough for the ladies, so they pledge to stay chained up as long as it takes. So FDR comes up with a pretty clever way of dealing with these women. He's going to send somebody from the Interior Department down with lunch, and along with lunch there's going to be lots and lots of tea and coffee and lemonade, and these women will keep being served tea and coffee and lemonade. And as the day wears on, the call of nature will be upon them, and these are very nice society ladies, so one after another they're going to have to start unchaining themselves to find the nearest facilities. Now, they're ultimately going to be unsuccessful in stopping the Jefferson Memorial from being built, but all of their protesting does get a lot of press coverage, and it forces Franklin D. Roosevelt to promise to replant every tree that has to be cut down. So they're going to actually move the trees as opposed to raise them. So thanks to Sissy Patterson and the Cherry Tree Rebellion, we have kept a beautiful grove of cherry blossom trees here by the memorial. So if you take a look behind me, you're going to see what the National Park Service refers to as the indicator tree. This is called the indicator tree because for some reason, nature, I can't explain it, I was a history major, but for some reason this tree is always ahead of all the other trees around the tidal basin. So we can use this to help mark those 5 stages of the bloom. And if you look behind me, this is already blooming. That means it's reached the 5th stage, puffy white, and it actually does this about 8 to 10 days ahead of the rest of the tree. So the indicator tree is how we can sort of keep track of the bloom and know when that peak bloom season is going to happen. Thank you so much for tuning in for our cherry blossom tour. If you enjoyed the tour today, be sure to hit the like button below. If you have any questions, put them in the comments and we'll do our best to answer all your questions. Of course, you want to subscribe to our channel. Make sure you get lots of great tour videos from the team here at Free Tours by Foot. If you want to buy your guide a cup of coffee, there's a link below for that as well. And if you're in Washington, D.C., be sure to book a tour with us.